I never expected my Airbnb experience to turn out the way it did. It seemed like the perfect getaway. A cozy, old apartment tucked in a quiet corner of a city I'd never visited before. The kind of place you see on Instagram, with polished wooden floors, intricate moldings, and high ceilings that spoke of age and character. A place that whispered stories of the past, yet felt comfortable enough to make me forget I was a stranger in a new town. I had found the listing online, and it caught my attention immediately. The photos showed rooms bathed in soft, natural light, showcasing the hardwood floors and those old-fashioned moldings that made it look like something out of a storybook. The apartment was on the top floor of an older building, a few stories up. The description said it was charming, and the reviews were glowing. People loved the atmosphere, the peace, and the location. It seemed perfect. I was traveling alone for a couple of days, needing some time to recharge and get away from the usual noise of everyday life. This place seemed like it would be just what I needed. The building itself was a bit worn, but that added to its character. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, and the floors creaked beneath my feet. When I stepped into the apartment, the charm was undeniable. The wooden floors stretched throughout the entire place, creaking a little underfoot as I walked. The windows were old, but they let in plenty of light, and the view from the top floor was nice. Nothing spectacular, but I could see the trees outside and a glimpse of the street below. Everything about the apartment had a nostalgic feel to it. I could tell the place had been well loved, though it had clearly seen better days. But one thing that caught my attention immediately was the staircase leading up to the bedroom. The stairs were steep and narrow, almost unnaturally so. The narrowness of the steps made it feel like you had to carefully place your feet to avoid slipping off, and each step creaked under the weight of even the lightest step. The staircase wasn't very long, maybe a dozen steps or so, but it was one of those old wooden staircases that felt like they might give way if you weren't careful. I figured it was just part of the building's charm. I wasn't too concerned at the time, but it was clear that the stairs were old, maybe a little too old. I decided to spend my first night there without much worry. The bed was comfortable enough, and the apartment was peaceful, tucked away from the noise of the city. It was a good night, with just the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. But that second night, things started to get weird. I was in the middle of watching a movie on my laptop when I heard it, an incredibly loud crash coming from upstairs. It was the kind of noise that made your heart skip a beat. I froze for a moment, unsure of what I had just heard. The sound was so jarring that it felt like something heavy had fallen, like furniture had tipped over, or maybe something worse. I rushed to the stairs, my mind racing, already thinking the worst. Had something fallen through the floor? I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But when I reached the top of the stairs, my stomach dropped. The staircase that had seemed so innocent before was now cracked wide open. The bottom part of the stairs had completely given way, leaving a jagged hole in the floor where the stairs used to be. It was like the entire structure of the stairs had just collapsed under its own weight. The wooden planks were splintered and broken, and I could see straight through the hole to the floor below. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the mess. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had just walked up those stairs not long ago, and now they were a hazard, a hole in the floor where there had once been something solid. I carefully stepped closer to the edge of the hole, testing the ground with my foot. I had narrowly avoided falling through, but it was obvious the stairs were poorly maintained, maybe even dangerous. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now it was clear the place wasn't as safe as I'd hoped. I was shaken, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. What the hell was going on with this place? How had the stairs just given way like that? I had been walking up them not 10 minutes ago, and now they were wrecked. I tried to calm myself down and not panic, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. I reached for my phone and called the host. The phone rang a few times before they picked up, their voice groggy, as if they'd just woken up. "Hello?" the host said. I quickly explained the situation, telling them about the crash and the stairs that had collapsed. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," they said, sounding oddly unfazed. "I'll have to check that out tomorrow." There was no urgency in their voice, no concern, no apology beyond the initial words. They didn't seem shocked or even particularly worried. I asked if they could come over or at least send someone to fix it, but they just apologized again and said they'd deal with it in the morning. The conversation was short, and it left me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had hoped for more reassurance, but instead, I was left with the distinct impression that the host didn't really care about the state of the apartment or my safety. It felt like they were brushing me off. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I made my way back down the narrow stairs, careful not to get too close to the hole. My mind kept replaying the crash, the loud, jarring noise that had startled me, and the image of the stairs now broken and dangerous. I didn't feel safe there anymore. The charm of the apartment was gone, replaced by a sense of foreboding. The building, the stairs, everything felt like it was falling apart, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept pacing around the apartment, checking the hole in the stairs every few minutes. The creaks of the floorboards seemed louder now, more ominous. I felt like the building itself was slowly collapsing around me, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I spent the night in a sort of restless anxiety, unable to relax or sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every creak of the floor felt like a warning. I kept thinking about the hole in the stairs, about how close I had come to falling through it. What if the whole place was unsafe? What if there was more damage I hadn't seen yet? What if something worse happened while I was still there? By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay there anymore. The sense of dread I felt in that apartment was overwhelming. I packed my things quickly, hardly bothering to take the time to properly organize my stuff. I didn't want to be there a second longer than I had to. I grabbed my bags, made sure I wasn't leaving anything behind, and rushed out of the apartment, heading down the narrow stairs as quickly as I could. I didn't even want to look back. When I reached the front door, I hesitated for just a moment before unlocking it and stepping into the street. I was out of the apartment, out of that building, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. I hadn't realized just how much the place had gotten under my skin until I was outside, in the fresh air, away from all the creaking wood and broken stairs. I checked out early and contacted the host again to let them know I was leaving. The response was the same as before, an apology but no real sense of urgency or concern. They didn't offer any compensation or even seem surprised by my decision to leave early. It was like they expected me to just accept what had happened and move on. I didn't respond. I just hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the experience lift off my shoulders. I was done with that place. I'd learned my lesson. Some charming old apartments weren't as charming as they seemed, and some stairs were better left unclimbed. I don't know if the host ever fixed the stairs or even bothered to inspect the rest of the apartment, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I'd rather take my chances with another place, another Airbnb, somewhere I felt safe and comfortable. And that's the thing about travel, you never really know what you're going to get. You hope for the best, but sometimes the charm of a place hides the cracks beneath the surface. I'd never make that mistake again. It was a Saturday morning when I finally made the decision to head to the coast for a much-needed break. After weeks of working overtime, I needed a change of pace. The idea of staying in a small, cozy cottage by the ocean sounded perfect. I had booked an Airbnb weeks ago, and the reviews were glowing. The host seemed friendly, quick to respond to messages, and even sent me clear instructions about finding the key under the welcome mat. Everything seemed like it was going to be exactly what I needed. The drive was scenic, one of those roads that wind along cliffs, offering glimpses of the ocean below, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace with every mile I drove. The air had that salty smell, the kind that makes you feel like you're already on vacation before you've even reached your destination. After about 2 hours, I pulled off the main highway and made my way down a narrow, twisting road that led to the cottage. It was tucked away in a secluded spot, with a view of the water just beyond a grove of coastal trees. The cottage itself was small but charming. It had a weathered look, with white painted wood and a front porch that looked like it belonged in an old postcard. It was exactly what I had imagined, a perfect little hideaway. The moment I parked in the gravel driveway, I could feel my shoulders start to relax. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and made my way up the short path to the door, scanning the area for the key. The instructions I'd received from the host were simple. Key is under the welcome mat. I checked there first, expecting to find it as described. But the mat was empty. I crouched down and looked more carefully. Nothing. I moved to the flower pot by the porch and peeked inside, even though I thought it seemed a bit strange. It wasn't mentioned in the instructions, but maybe it was a backup? Sure enough, there was a key hidden inside the pot, tucked under some dirt. I sighed with relief, grabbed the key, and unlocked the door. The first thing I noticed as I stepped inside was how off the place felt. It wasn't anything obvious, but it was the kind of thing that just unsettles you. The air felt stuffy, like it hadn't been ventilated properly. The space was small, just a living room, kitchen, and a small hallway that led to a couple of bedrooms. The furniture was simple, but the living room sofa was slightly askew, as if someone had recently sat down and stood up quickly. The coffee table was moved just a little too far from the couch. It seemed like it had been used, but the place was supposed to be cleaned and ready for me. I put my bag down on the couch and started taking a closer look around, trying to shake off the odd feeling that was creeping up my spine. The kitchen was small but functional, with a clean counter and some dishes drying by the sink. There was a fridge, and I opened it just to check for any food left behind. It was empty, save for a few bottles of water. Nothing strange about that. But then I saw something on the kitchen table, a letter. It was folded neatly, with a name written on the front in neat handwriting. I glanced at it. The name on the envelope wasn't mine. In fact, it was addressed to someone else entirely. The handwriting didn't look like the host's either. It was almost too formal, like a business letter. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to push it away. I had booked this place through Airbnb. I had the right address. The host had confirmed it several times. I double-checked the booking details on my phone. It said clearly, Coastal Cottage number 5, host's name. Still, the letter left a knot in my stomach. I walked over and picked it up, flipping it over to see the seal. It was an envelope with no return address. I thought for a moment about opening it, but that felt wrong. It wasn't addressed to me. I set it back down on the table carefully and stood there for a moment, looking around. The cottage felt too lived in. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed in a vacation rental, and normally, there would be at least a small welcoming note from the host, maybe some snacks or a guidebook to the area. But there was nothing. No warm, welcoming gesture. Just the letter and the uneasy feeling that someone had been here recently. I turned back to the living room. Everything was still. The curtains were drawn, blocking the view of the ocean. The place had a strange, claustrophobic feel to it, despite its open layout. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I could have been imagining things. I decided to unpack and settle in. I walked into the bedroom and opened the small closet. There were fresh linens, which reassured me, but as I turned around to unpack my things, I noticed something on the nightstand. A small book. It wasn't the kind of book you'd expect to find in a rental, something like a popular beach read or a local guide. It was a journal, bound in soft leather. The pages looked worn, and I could see a faint yellowing along the edges of the paper. It had the look of something old, something personal. It wasn't something that would belong in a rental property. I hesitated before picking it up, but something inside me made me flip it open. The first page was filled with a dense, looping handwriting. It looked like a diary, but as I read, I realized it wasn't a simple personal reflection. The entries were unsettling. The writer spoke of strange things happening at the cottage. Noises in the night, things being moved around, a feeling of being watched. At first, the entries were vague, almost poetic. But as the pages went on, the entries grew darker. The writer described hearing whispers, even seeing things move on their own. It didn't sound like anything normal. My heart was racing now. This was too much. I dropped the journal back onto the nightstand, and I quickly left the room. I needed air. The feeling of unease in the house was too strong. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, making my way down the gravel path to the beach. I needed to clear my head. The waves crashed against the shore as I walked along the sand. The wind whipped through my hair, and for a moment, I felt a little calmer. The coastal view was breathtaking, vast and open, with nothing but the sound of the ocean to fill the silence. I stood there for a while, just breathing, but the sense of dread that had built up inside me wouldn't go away. I kept thinking about the letter, the journal, the feeling of someone having been there before me. After walking for a while, I made my way back to the cottage. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I thought that maybe stepping away for a bit would help. But when I reached the porch, I froze. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was certain I had closed it when I left. I stepped inside slowly, glancing around. The house felt emptier now, quieter, but there was still that lingering sense of something being off. The furniture was exactly how I had left it, but now it seemed even more out of place. I went back to the kitchen table. The letter was gone. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it. But now it was nowhere to be found. That was the final straw. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This place, this cottage, felt wrong. It wasn't just the strange little details or the unsettling feeling in the air. It was everything about it. It was the letter, the journal, the door left open. It was like I had stepped into someone else's life, and whatever had happened here was something I wasn't supposed to know about. I grabbed my bag, and I left. I couldn't stay there another minute. The drive back to the nearby hotel felt like the longest I'd ever taken. It was only a few miles, but it felt like a lifetime. I checked into the hotel, relieved to be away from the cottage. The host had been kind, and the Airbnb listing had looked so perfect, but now I felt like I was escaping something. I never went back to that cottage. A part of me wanted to ask the host about the letter, about the journal, but I didn't want to know. I didn't want to hear any explanation that would make it seem normal. I don't know who had been there before me or why that letter was addressed to someone else, but something about that place, something about the way it felt, told me I wasn't meant to stay. I can't explain it. I still can't. But the sense of being watched, the unease in that small coastal cottage, was enough to make me never want to go near it again. I don't know what happened there, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I rented a small cottage on the edge of a quiet lake for a peaceful retreat. I was hoping to escape the busy grind of city life for a while, to clear my head and recharge. The listing had promised everything I wanted. A cozy, secluded cabin with stunning views of the water, all surrounded by tall trees. Seemed perfect, exactly what I needed. When I arrived, the host greeted me with a warm smile. He was an older man, probably in his early 60s, with a scruffy beard and a gentle voice. He introduced himself as Alan, and he made me feel immediately comfortable. As he showed me around the cabin, he explained everything: how to work the heating, where the extra blankets were, and how to avoid disturbing the wildlife by keeping the porch light off at night. He even handed me a small basket with homemade cookies and a jar of tea leaves, telling me they were local favorites. I thought it was a nice touch, and I appreciated the warm welcome. The first few days went by just as I had hoped. The cottage was small but charming, with wooden beams on the ceiling and large windows that looked out over the lake. I spent my mornings drinking tea on the porch, watching the fog roll over the water. In the afternoons, I would hike around the area, taking in the scenery, or sit by the fire with a good book. It was the kind of peaceful, slow pace that I had longed for. But after the first couple of days, something started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, just small things that didn't sit right with me. Alan started stopping by more often than I had expected. He would knock on the door at least once or twice a day, usually bringing up random topics like the weather or how the lake was looking that morning. Sometimes he'd stay for a while and we'd chat for longer than I expected. It wasn't like he was forcing me into conversations, but he seemed to be there more than he should have been, especially when I was supposed to be on a solo retreat. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just his way of being friendly. But as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore the feeling that he was keeping an eye on me. He'd casually mention things that made me realize he had been paying much closer attention to my movements than I'd thought. One day, he commented on the book I was reading, asking if I liked it. I had barely mentioned the book to anyone, let alone to him. Another time, he told me that he'd noticed I had walked to the north side of the lake earlier in the morning, which was where I usually hiked. That's when I began to feel uneasy. The strange thing was, whenever I tried to bring up the subject of privacy or having some space, he'd always laugh it off, saying something like, "Just making sure you're comfortable, just making sure you're enjoying your stay." It seemed harmless, but it felt a bit too much. Still, I didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful, so I kept it to myself, hoping the feeling would pass. Then, one afternoon, I decided to take the kayak out onto the lake. It was a warm, sunny day, and the water looked inviting. I wanted to enjoy the quiet of the lake, away from everything. I paddled out, taking in the calmness of the water and the peaceful silence. The only sound was the soft splashing of the paddle and the occasional bird call from the trees. I was alone, just how I liked it. But as I paddled further from shore, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Alan was standing on the shore, watching me. I didn't see him at first, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw his figure standing by a tree, staring at me. It wasn't like he was waving or trying to get my attention. He was just standing there, motionless, watching me. I couldn't tell how long he had been there, but the unease I had been feeling for the past few days suddenly intensified. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. He was probably just checking in, maybe making sure I was safe on the water. Still, the feeling that I was being watched lingered. I paddled back toward the shore as quickly as I could, my movements feeling rushed and unnatural. When I returned to the cabin, Alan was nowhere to be seen, but I felt his presence in the air, as if he had been watching me even after I couldn't see him. That night, as I sat in the cabin, I heard a faint knock on the door. It was Alan, standing there with his usual friendly smile. He asked if I was enjoying my time on the lake and if I had been able to get some good photos. I said yes, trying to keep my voice steady, but something about the way he asked made me feel like he knew exactly what I had been doing. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant interruptions, the odd comments, the way he seemed to know everything about me without me ever sharing much. It was too much. I had come here for peace, to get away from everything, but now I felt trapped, like I was under constant surveillance. I decided that I had to leave early. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The idea of seeing Alan again made my skin crawl. I had no intention of telling him why I was leaving, or how uncomfortable I felt. I just wanted to get out of there. As I loaded my car, I glanced up at the cottage, and that's when I saw him. Alan was standing in the window, just behind the sheer curtains, waving. His face was expressionless, but the gesture felt unsettling, like he had been waiting for me to leave. I didn't wave back. Instead, I quickly got into my car and drove off, not looking back. As I left the gravel driveway and turned onto the main road, I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The drive back home was long, but I couldn't stop thinking about that feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the image of Alan standing by the window, waving like it was the most normal thing in the world. My mind kept running through all the small interactions, all the strange moments that, when pieced together, painted a picture of someone who had been paying much closer attention to me than I was comfortable with. When I got home, I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on the positives of the trip, the beauty of the lake, the quiet moments of solitude, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alan standing there, in the window watching me leave. I never left reviews for places I stayed, but this time I couldn't stay quiet. I wrote a review on the Airbnb listing, just a short one, explaining that the host had been overly involved and that I didn't feel comfortable during my stay. I didn't want to say too much, didn't want to make a scene, but I felt it was important to warn others who might be looking for a peaceful retreat, just like I had. A few weeks later, I checked the listing again. Alan had responded to my review, thanking me for my feedback and saying he hoped I had enjoyed my time, but that he had to make sure his guests were comfortable because he lived alone and didn't want anyone to feel unsafe. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that he felt justified in his actions, or that he truly didn't understand why I'd felt so uncomfortable. I never went back to that cottage, and I've never rented from a host like that again. I couldn't help but wonder how many other guests had felt the same way but hadn't said anything. I still don't know if Alan's intentions were harmless or if he genuinely wanted to make sure I was okay. But whatever the case, I'll always remember the feeling of being watched, and I'll never forget the way he waved as I left. I booked the cottage in the mountains because I needed a break. A weekend alone, away from the noise and the chaos of the city. I found it on Airbnb, secluded, peaceful, surrounded by forest. It seemed perfect for what I needed, a chance to get away from it all. I had no idea how much I'd regret that decision. The drive was long. It was just me, my car, and the winding roads that twisted up into the mountains. The GPS had been directing me for hours, through thick woods and narrow lanes, where there were no other cars. The landscape grew more and more isolated the further I went. The occasional house or farmhouse was visible, but there was no one around. It was just me and the land. The silence was deafening. As I approached the cottage, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it was. I knew it would be remote, but this was beyond what I had imagined. There were no neighbors, no signs of life. The driveway leading up to the house was long and overgrown with weeds. The yard had grass that looked like it hadn't been mowed in months. The house itself was old, weathered, with chipped paint on the outside and sagging windowsills. It looked abandoned, like it had been forgotten by time. I parked my car in front, the tires crunching on the gravel, and sat there for a moment, wondering if I'd made a mistake. The place was so quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. But I convinced myself to shrug it off. This was what I'd signed up for, an escape, a break from the everyday. I grabbed my things from the car and walked up to the door, which was already slightly ajar. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the host hadn't fully closed it after preparing the place for my stay. But as I pushed the door open, I felt a chill run through me. The inside of the house was dim, and it smelled old, like dust and decay. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a couch that looked like it had seen better days, covered in a thin layer of dust. A coffee table was cluttered with old magazines, yellowed with age. The kitchen was a mess, with dishes left in the sink, food left out on the counter, as if someone had just walked away and never came back. The fridge door was open, but nothing inside except some moldy leftovers. It felt wrong, like someone had just packed up and left in a hurry. My first thought was that the house had been abandoned for years, and the listing was a mistake. But there was a key in the lockbox, and it had been left there for me. The host had to have known I was coming. I walked through the house, checking every room. It was cold inside, and the air felt stale. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I explored, the sound echoing in the silence. Upstairs was worse. There was a small hallway with a few doors, all closed. The rooms were empty except for dust and old furniture that looked like it had been left there for years. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the house wasn't in perfect condition, but it wasn't abandoned. It just needed some cleaning up. That night, I sat on the couch in the living room, watching the dim light from a single lamp flicker. The only sound in the house was the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling in the pit of my stomach, but it didn't go away. The more I thought about it, the more I started to feel uneasy. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. The house was supposed to be empty. The host hadn't said anything about other people being around. I stood up slowly, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, but then I heard a door creak open. I didn't move. I just stood there, straining to hear, but there was nothing else. The house was still. I walked upstairs carefully, trying not to make a sound. My feet barely touched the floor as I made my way down the hall to the room where the sound had come from. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the door was still closed. I reached for the knob, my hand shaking, and turned it. The door opened into an empty room. Just a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out into the forest. Nothing out of place. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish, before I turned and walked back downstairs. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise kept me awake. Creaks in the floor, the wind howling outside, things I usually wouldn't think twice about. But the house felt wrong. It wasn't just the isolation or the state of disrepair. It was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I decided to go out for a walk. I needed to clear my head. Maybe I was just overreacting. It had been a long drive, and I had been alone in a quiet house for too long. The fresh air would do me good. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, letting the crisp mountain air fill my lungs. The yard was as overgrown as it had been the night before, but now, in the daylight, it felt even more neglected. I walked around the property, keeping my distance from the woods that seemed to press in on all sides. There was a small creek that ran nearby, but I didn't get too close. The place felt off. I went back inside after about an hour. I needed to check the place again, maybe clean up a little. As I was walking through the kitchen, I noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper on the counter. I hadn't seen it before, and I definitely hadn't left it there. It was an envelope, old and yellowed with age. I picked it up and opened it, curious. Inside was a letter written in messy handwriting. The letter was from the previous tenants. They explained how they had rented the house for a short stay, but they'd left in a hurry. The letter warned me about the house, claiming it was haunted. They said they'd experienced strange things. Footsteps when no one was there, doors opening on their own, things moving around the house. They wrote that they'd stayed one night and left the next morning, unable to take the feeling of being watched any longer. They described the house as alive, like it had a presence of its own, something that didn't want anyone there. The letter ended with a warning to get out if I valued my safety, saying they'd left as fast as they could and never looked back. My heart started to race as I read the letter again. The words didn't make sense, and yet they felt real. I felt like I was in a bad dream. The things they described, footsteps, doors creaking open, the feeling of being watched, had happened to me. It was like they were describing my experience. I stood there for a long time, holding the letter in my shaking hands. I wasn't sure what to think. Could they have been exaggerating? Was this just an old, decaying house, and I was letting my mind run wild? Or was there something more to it? I didn't wait around to find out. I packed up my things quickly, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. I could still hear the sound of the door creaking open in my mind, but I didn't stop to check if it was real. I didn't want to know. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The trees loomed over it, casting long shadows, and the wind whipped through the yard, making the grass sway. The house stood silent, abandoned, like it had been for years, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't empty. I wasn't sure what was going on there, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I drove away, my heart still pounding, hoping to put the place far behind me. But the image of that old, lonely house stayed with me, haunting me long after I left the mountains behind. I had been planning my trip for months. I was excited to get away for a few days with my best friend, to experience something new. We wanted to go somewhere quiet, a place to unwind and explore, away from the daily grind. After a few weeks of searching, we came across an Airbnb listing that seemed perfect. The pictures were stunning. Everything was bright, modern, and clean. The host's reviews were mostly positive, and the place looked like a hidden gem tucked away in a quiet part of town. We booked it without thinking twice. The day we arrived, we were eager to see it in person. We pulled up to the address, and at first, everything seemed fine. It was a house somewhat secluded, with a small driveway that led up to it. There were trees around the property, giving it that private feeling we were hoping for. But as soon as we stepped out of the car, we noticed something off. The yard, though not large, was overgrown. There was a layer of leaves and debris on the ground, and some of the windows had a foggy, neglected look to them. We shrugged it off. It was no big deal, just a bit of a messy yard, nothing that would ruin our trip. But when we walked inside, we both froze. The house didn't match the pictures at all. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was there. A faint musty odor, something damp, almost like old towels left in a corner for too long. The walls were marked with stains, some of them brownish and splotchy, as if there had been some kind of water damage. The floors creaked as we stepped through the living room, and we could tell right away that the place hadn't been properly maintained in quite some time. The furniture was mismatched and falling apart. The couch in the living room had a sagging middle, and one of the chairs had a large tear along the side, exposing the stuffing inside. The coffee table was chipped, and there were scratches and gouges along the wood, as if someone had been too rough with it. Even the lampshades looked a little too worn out for a house that was supposedly well kept. The kitchen, which had seemed so modern in the photos, was another disappointment. The countertops were cluttered with old appliances and dried-up plants. The fridge was dingy, and when I opened it, I found a couple of leftover containers with unidentifiable food, crusted and abandoned. The sink had some water stains, and the faucet was loose, barely hanging on. But it was the bathroom that really made us question our decision. The bathroom was small and cramped, but it didn't look anything like the bright, clean space in the pictures. The tiles on the floor were cracked and uneven. One of the lights was flickering, and the mirror was so dirty I could barely make out my reflection. But the worst part was the smell. It wasn't just musty, it was rotten, almost like something had died in the walls. The kind of smell that clings to everything, sinking into your clothes and hair. I tried to make the best of it. After all, it was just a few nights. But by the time night fell, things started to feel off. We both tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up our spines, but it was hard. The house just didn't feel right. The creaking floorboards, the draft coming from somewhere unknown, the occasional thudding noises we couldn't place. All of it made it feel like the house was alive, somehow. It was as if it were sighing and groaning in its sleep. That night, as we tried to sleep, I noticed something else. The mold. It had started to grow on the walls, small patches, mostly in the corners and along the edges of the ceiling. They were dark, and it was clear that it had been there for a while. I turned to my friend, but she was already asleep, too tired to care about the state of the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, and wandered around the house. The lights flickered as I moved through the rooms, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I could hear something small, almost like a tapping noise, but when I tried to locate it, there was nothing, just silence. The next morning, we tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just our overactive imaginations. We spent the day out exploring the area, trying to make the best of it. We had planned to relax, to enjoy the quiet, but every time we came back to the house, the reality of how much it was falling apart hit us harder. By the second night, the mold had spread even more. It was no longer just a few patches, it was everywhere. The walls were covered in dark, greenish-black splotches. I didn't know much about mold, but it didn't look healthy. I had to call the host. I had no choice. We'd already spent 2 nights in the place, and I was starting to feel uneasy. I sent a message explaining everything: the mold, the plumbing issues, the fact that the house didn't match the listing at all. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, hoping for a quick response. But there was nothing. No response. I sent another message a few hours later, asking if they could at least send someone to fix the plumbing, which had stopped working properly. Still nothing. By the 3rd night, I couldn't take it anymore. The smell from the bathroom had gotten worse. It was no longer just a faint odor, it was overpowering. The mold was spreading so fast that I was starting to worry about health issues. I sent one more message, this time letting them know I was planning to report them if I didn't hear back. That's when the host finally replied. They apologized, claimed that there had been a recent water issue, and promised to send someone to take care of the problem. But at that point, I was done. I didn't trust them. I didn't trust the house. And I certainly didn't want to risk staying another night in a place that felt unsafe, unhealthy, and completely different from what we had been promised. We packed up our things, checked out, and found a last-minute hotel nearby. It wasn't the glamorous trip we had imagined, but it was a safe, clean place to stay, and at least we knew we weren't going to be breathing in mold or worrying about the plumbing failing on us in the middle of the night. The rest of the trip went smoothly. We explored the area during the day and stayed in the hotel at night, but that experience stayed with me. It was a harsh reminder of how easy it is to be deceived by pictures and reviews online. It wasn't just the house that bothered me. It was the way the host had handled everything. The lack of communication, the empty promises, and the complete disregard for the condition of the place. It was like they didn't care about the people staying in their home, just the money. When I got back home, I left a review. I didn't want to scare anyone, but I felt like people needed to know the truth. The house was nothing like what we were promised, and it wasn't safe to stay in. I even included photos of the mold and the damaged furniture, just to show how bad it really was. I didn't expect much, but a few days later, I received a message from the host. They didn't apologize. They didn't try to make things right. They just asked me to remove the review, claiming it was unfair and that things were taken care of. It made my blood boil. I didn't respond. It's been a few months now, but I still think about that trip. The place seemed like a hidden gem at first, but it was anything but. I learned a valuable lesson. Always trust your instincts and never take a place at face value. A pretty picture and a glowing review can hide a lot of problems, and sometimes it's just better to walk away. I had rented a small, cute studio in the city for a solo trip. The listing on Airbnb made it sound perfect, cozy, private, and the ideal place to unwind after a long drive. I'd been craving a few days of peace, just me, my thoughts, and some time to explore a new place. I didn't mind the idea of being alone in a new city, and the pictures of the studio looked like exactly what I needed. The neighborhood was quiet. The studio itself was tucked away on a side street, and everything about it felt like a safe, peaceful retreat. When I first arrived, I was a little surprised by how small it was, but that was exactly what I had expected. The building was older, and the door creaked a bit when I pushed it open. There was something charming about the little quirks, like the antique furniture and the soft, vintage wallpaper that lined the walls. The place was clean, tidy, and smelled faintly of lavender. Nothing that would give off any warning signs. I stepped inside, setting down my bags, thinking about how relaxing the next few days would be. But that's when I felt it. A strange chill in the air. Nothing extreme, just a slight shift in temperature, like a breeze brushing past me. I couldn't explain it, but it was enough to make me pause. The door had swung open on its own when I entered, but I dismissed it. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly when I walked in. I gave myself a mental shake, trying to push the feeling aside. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows. Everything seemed fine. I unpacked a bit, then decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. I figured it was probably just my nerves. The city felt different at night, quieter than I'd expected, with a certain eerie calm. It was a stark contrast to the bright, bustling part of town I had passed on my way in. I spent a few hours wandering around, not really sure where I was going, just taking in the sights and sounds of a new place. But as I walked back toward the studio, that same feeling of unease crept up again. It wasn't anything specific, just a vague sense that something was off. I chalked it up to being in a new city, staying in a new place. It wasn't anything to worry about. I wasn't the type to get easily spooked. By the time I got back, it was dark, and the air felt cool and crisp. I grabbed some takeout, locked the door behind me, and settled in for the night. It was a bit of a relief to finally sit down and relax after the long day of driving and exploring. I ate, turned on the TV, and let myself get comfortable. The bed was small, but cozy, and the soft sheets felt nice after being on the road for so long. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned for hours, feeling like something wasn't right. It wasn't that I felt unsafe. It was more like an anxious feeling that I couldn't shake. At one point, I woke up to what sounded like someone whispering my name. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or if I was awake. The room was dark, and the sound had been so faint that I questioned whether I'd imagined it. I sat there, listening to the silence of the apartment, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. I had just spent the whole day on edge, after all, with the new place and the unfamiliar surroundings. I laid back down, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. But then I heard it again, so faint I almost couldn't believe it. My name. I got up, a bit shaken now, and moved toward the door. The apartment was completely still, but as I approached the door, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. Maybe an inch or two, just enough for a draft to slip through. I stepped closer to it, feeling a sudden jolt of panic in my chest. There was no way the door had been open when I had gone to bed. I had locked it securely. I closed it again, the latch clicking into place. The sound was so final, and yet the unease wouldn't go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the apartment. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. But the silence that followed was almost worse than the whispering. It was heavy, oppressive. I finally crawled back into bed, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to peek through the window. I tried to push the strange events of the night out of my mind. I had a busy day planned, and I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me. But as I got out of bed and went to stretch, I froze. There, on the floor, leading from the door to the edge of the bed, were muddy footprints. Not just one or two, but a trail of them, as though someone had walked through the apartment. I immediately checked the door. It was locked, just like it had been when I went to sleep. There was no way someone had come in, but the footprints were real. I crouched down to inspect them, feeling a cold wave of panic wash over me. They were fresh, leaving deep impressions in the carpet, as though someone had been walking around my apartment in the night. My hands shook as I backed away, my mind racing. How could this be happening? Who had been in my apartment? I checked the windows, the locks, and every corner of the studio. Everything was in place, everything was secure. But the footprints, they weren't just outside my door, they were inside too, leading right to my bed. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. I checked the locks again. Everything was locked. Everything was exactly as it should be. But there was no denying it. Someone had been in here. The feeling of dread hit me hard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to think about the possibility that someone had been watching me, or worse, had been in here for God knows how long. I didn't know who it could have been, or how they had gotten in. But the realization that I wasn't safe here anymore hit me like a punch to the gut. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the air in the room felt thick with fear. My first instinct was to leave, to get out of that apartment as quickly as possible. But I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened. Had someone been in here, or had I just imagined it all? The footprints were real, but the question remained, who could have left them? I grabbed my things and started to pack quickly, my hands still trembling. My mind was spinning. The more I thought about it, the more my mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. Could it have been the building's maintenance guy? A neighbor? Or worse, someone who had been watching me? I didn't want to stay another minute. As I pulled my bags together and stuffed my things into my car, I kept looking around, half expecting to see someone in the corner of my eye. I had never been so terrified in my life, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being watched. The whole situation felt wrong, like I had walked right into some kind of nightmare. I didn't stay to find out. I drove straight to the nearest hotel, not even bothering to check out the rest of the city or finish the trip I had planned. All I wanted was to get as far away from that studio as possible. I didn't trust it anymore, didn't trust anyone who could have been inside it. I reported it to Airbnb, but I didn't expect any real answers or comfort from them. The footprints weren't some sort of mistake. They were real. Someone had been there. I don't know who, and I didn't care to find out. I didn't go back to the city after that. The whole experience, from the whispers to the muddy footprints, left a feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something is wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. And that's why I left. I didn't want to wait around for an answer or try to figure out what happened. I just wanted to get away, to forget everything that had happened in that studio. And to this day, I still don't know who or what had been in that apartment with me. The Airbnb I rented seemed peaceful enough. A small cottage tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of place you'd expect in a small, suburban town. Neat houses lined up in a row, well-maintained gardens, and an overall sense of calm that settled over you as soon as you arrived. The moment I pulled up, I felt like I was in the right spot. I was looking for a quiet weekend away from the chaos of my regular life, and this place seemed to promise just that. The cottage itself was small, with a white picket fence surrounding a modest front yard. The windows were framed with flower boxes, and the red door stood out against the pale yellow walls. The listing had described it as a cozy hideaway, and that's exactly what it was. It looked perfect for some rest. I unlocked the door with the code the host had sent me, and everything inside was just as advertised. Clean, well-lit, and charming. The floors creaked underfoot, but it was the kind of old, rustic charm you expect from a house like this. The living room had a comfortable couch, a couple of chairs, and a stone fireplace that, even though I wasn't planning on using it, added to the cozy ambience. The kitchen was small but functional, with a little dining nook near the window where you could see the quiet street outside. After unpacking, I sat down on the couch with a book and a cup of tea, and everything felt perfect. It was one of those rare moments where you can truly unwind, not worrying about anything. The kind of place that makes you feel safe, even though you're technically a stranger in a stranger's home. The next day, however, things started to feel a little off. It was around noon when there was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I saw an old man standing there. His face was weathered, and his hair was thin and gray, matching the flannel shirt he wore. He looked like he'd been living in the neighborhood for years, maybe decades. He smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a smile that felt forced, practiced. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you're not bothering the neighborhood," he said, his voice raspy but calm. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It was such an odd thing to say, but I assumed he was just being friendly, maybe a little overly concerned. People in small towns can be like that, right? I smiled politely and reassured him that I hadn't been causing any trouble. He nodded, and with a short goodbye, he turned and walked back down the small path between the houses. I watched him disappear behind the fence and then closed the door, feeling a little unsettled but dismissing it as nothing. The next day, though, he returned. This time, he was much more aggressive. There was no polite knock, no awkward but harmless conversation. He banged on the door so hard it made me jump. I opened it quickly, and he stood there with his face red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're being too loud," he shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "The neighbors don't like it. You need to keep it down." I was taken aback. I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't even turned on the TV or played music. I tried to explain, but he wasn't having it. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, and his hands were shaking now. The words were coming out of his mouth in a rapid, almost incoherent rush. "You're disturbing everyone. You need to leave. Go. Now." I stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. Was this just some strange, confused old man? Or was he trying to intimidate me for some reason? I didn't know, but something in his eyes told me this wasn't normal behavior. It wasn't the kind of thing a friendly neighbor does, and I started to feel a knot of unease twist in my stomach. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to stay calm. "I haven't been loud at all. I'm just trying to relax." His gaze didn't soften. "I don't want to hear it. Keep it down or I'll make sure you do." I didn't know what that meant, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. I nodded, closed the door, and locked it. For the rest of the day, I didn't hear from him again, and I tried to push the incident to the back of my mind. But that night, things got worse. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A faint tapping sound, like someone was lightly tapping on the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if I was just hearing things. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and tiptoed to the window. My breath caught in my throat when I pulled back the curtain. There, just outside the window, was the old man. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. His mouth was stretched into a grin, a twisted, unsettling grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across his face. I gasped, and the noise was enough to make him move. He stepped back slightly, but his grin didn't fade. He just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, my hand frozen on the curtain. The only sound in the room was the thumping of my own heart, pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I snapped the curtain shut and backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just confused. Maybe he didn't realize how unsettling his actions were. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I locked the window as tight as I could, checked the door, and made sure everything was secure. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach. I didn't feel safe anymore. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things quickly, not caring if I left a few things behind. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I loaded up the car, I glanced over at the cottage next door. The blinds were drawn, but I thought I saw a figure standing behind them, watching me. It made my skin crawl. I didn't stick around to see if the old man would come back. I just drove. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the nearest city. I didn't even want to go back home just yet. I didn't want to be alone. It was only after I had calmed down a little and could think clearly that I realized something. The host had never mentioned anything about the old man. There had been no warning about a neighbor who might make me feel uncomfortable or who might show up uninvited. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered. Was he just some lonely old man? Or was there something more to him? Maybe he'd been watching me from the start, waiting for the right moment to make his presence known. I didn't know, but the thought made my skin crawl all over again. What was his game? Why had he acted so aggressively, even when I hadn't done anything to provoke him? And why had he been standing outside my window, grinning like that? I'll never know for sure, but I don't ever want to find out. I'll never stay in that neighborhood again, and I'll never forget the way his eyes looked that night, staring at me through the window, cold, calculating, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. That experience was enough to make me rethink everything about that peaceful little cottage. What seemed like a quiet retreat turned out to be a nightmare in disguise, and I'm never going back. I had been looking forward to a relaxing weekend getaway for weeks. My work had been stressful, and I desperately needed a break. After browsing through countless Airbnb listings, I finally found a place that seemed perfect. A stylish, modern apartment located in a trendy part of the city. The photos were gorgeous. Everything looked pristine, with sleek furniture, large windows letting in plenty of natural light, and minimalist decor that made the place feel luxurious. The location was ideal, close to restaurants, shops, and public transportation. I felt like I had hit the jackpot, so I quickly booked it for the weekend. The day of my check-in arrived, and I couldn't wait to get to the apartment. I had packed light, just a small suitcase with a few clothes, a book, and some snacks. I drove to the address, excited to start my short vacation. When I arrived, the neighborhood seemed nice. Quiet, a little upscale, and exactly what I had hoped for. I grabbed my bag, checked the code to get inside, and opened the door. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. I paused, looking around. The place did look like the photos, but there was something about the air. It didn't smell fresh, like I had expected. Instead, it was thick with a musty odor that hit me immediately. My nose wrinkled at the strange, damp scent, like old furniture or a basement that hadn't been aired out properly. I shook my head, dismissing it. Maybe the place had been closed up for a while, and it just needed some air circulation. I didn't want to be picky. After all, the photos had looked good, and I was here to relax. I set my suitcase down and took a deeper look around. The living room was nice, spacious and with large windows that let in plenty of light, just like the listing had promised. The furniture was modern and stylish, but there were things that made me uneasy. The walls were covered in what looked like random dark spots, some large, others small. At first, I thought maybe it was just an issue with the lighting or the way the place was painted, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. Damp patches like water had seeped into the walls and left stains behind. I frowned, unsure of what I was seeing. I was no expert on home maintenance, but the discoloration looked like it could be mold or something worse. I decided to check out the bathroom next, hoping it would at least be as pristine as the photos had shown. But as soon as I opened the door, I was hit with a wave of mildew. It burned my nose immediately, like the smell of wet towels that had been left in a pile for too long. The bathroom itself was clean, at least on the surface, but the air was thick with that pungent odor that seemed to settle in my throat. I couldn't even breathe properly without feeling a tickle in the back of my throat. I turned on the shower, hoping the steam would clear the air, but it didn't help. It only made the smell worse, like it was trapped in the very walls. I ran my fingers along the edge of the sink and noticed the grout was darker than it should have been. I bent down to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. Tiny black specks near the corners of the tiles. Mold. It was there, creeping in the corners, staining the grout. I stepped back, my stomach churning. The air felt heavier now, like it was pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake booking this place. But I didn't want to let a little mold ruin my weekend. Maybe it was just a minor issue, something that could be dealt with. I tried to ignore the feeling of dread that started to creep in. I opened the window in the bathroom, hoping to get some fresh air, but that didn't help either. The musty smell lingered. I wandered around the apartment a bit more, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. The bedroom was comfortable enough, with a large bed covered in fresh white sheets. The windows were open slightly, but the air still felt stale, no matter how much I tried to air it out. I set my bag down on the bed and sat for a moment, feeling my energy start to drain away. After a few minutes, I started to feel lightheaded. It wasn't just the air anymore. It was as if the mustiness was seeping into my body, affecting my senses. My head started to feel fuzzy, and my eyes watered. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I had never been sensitive to smells like this before, but now everything felt wrong. The air in the apartment seemed thicker, like I was breathing in something that was making me dizzy. I checked the walls again, running my fingers over the spots I had seen earlier. I was starting to get nervous now. The dark patches on the walls were growing bigger as I moved around the apartment. It wasn't just the bathroom anymore, it was everywhere. There were dark spots along the edges of the living room walls, and the smell was stronger now, making my head spin. I went back to the bathroom to check for any more signs of mold, and when I looked more closely, I could see it crawling up the walls. It was more than just the grout. It was in the corners of the walls, spreading like a slow, silent invasion. That's when I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I felt grossed out, trapped, and most of all, I felt sick. I grabbed my phone and tried to contact the host. I didn't want to make a scene, but I needed to know if this was normal or if I was just being too sensitive. I sent a message, explaining what I had found, asking for clarification. I needed to know if they were aware of the mold and if it was safe to stay. The host's response came within minutes, and it was the kind of response I should have expected. They apologized and said the apartment had been cleaned, and that the smell was just due to the old pipes. They reassured me that the apartment was safe to stay in, and that I should just open a window or use the air conditioning to get rid of the odor. No mention of mold or any real concern about the issues I had raised. I wasn't convinced. I felt a growing sense of urgency to leave. I wasn't going to risk getting sick over the weekend. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, still feeling dizzy and uneasy as I moved through the apartment. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the air itself was holding me in place. Every step I took seemed slower, like the apartment was trying to keep me inside. I left the apartment and stepped into the fresh air, finally feeling a sense of relief as I walked down the street. My mind was still racing. What had I just experienced? How could a place that looked so perfect in the pictures be so completely different in person? I was disgusted by the thought of spending another moment in that apartment, but I was also angry that I had paid for a place that had been misrepresented. I contacted Airbnb immediately, explaining the situation in detail. I sent them photos of the mold, the dark spots on the walls, and the mildew in the bathroom. I told them how I had been affected physically by the condition of the apartment, and I requested a full refund. I didn't expect it to be easy, but I had to try. To their credit, Airbnb responded quickly. They apologized for the condition of the apartment and agreed to issue a refund. They also said they would investigate the listing to make sure it met their cleanliness standards. I felt a wave of relief wash over me when I got the email confirming the refund. At least something had gone right in this situation. But I was left with a lingering sense of disgust. I couldn't believe how misrepresented the apartment had been. The photos had shown a place that looked fresh and clean, but in reality, it was a health hazard. It wasn't just a minor issue. It was a serious problem, and I was lucky I hadn't stayed there longer, letting the mold and mildew affect my health even more. I spent the rest of my weekend in a much better place. A cozy little hotel with clean, fresh rooms and no surprises. I was relieved to have gotten out of that apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how vulnerable I had been. I trusted the photos, the listing, the reviews, and the host. And in the end, it felt like I had been completely let down. I've learned my lesson. Next time, I'll make sure to ask more questions before booking a place, and I'll never again take a listing's photos at face value. Airbnb may have refunded me, but that experience left a sour taste in my mouth. There's nothing worse than being stuck in a place that feels like it's slowly making you sick, and knowing there's no way out. I had found the perfect Airbnb for my family. It was a 2-story house, big enough for everyone to have their own space, yet cozy enough that we'd still feel like we were all together. The listing had all the amenities you'd expect: a full kitchen, a huge living room with a fireplace, and a couple of bathrooms. The host described it as a charming getaway, nestled in a quiet neighborhood just outside of town. The pictures made it look like a dream. The interior was full of rustic charm, with wooden beams, big windows letting in tons of light, and enough space to spread out but not feel lost. I remember being excited when I pulled up. It was everything I had hoped for, even more so. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the yard was big enough for my kids to run around in. It was secluded enough that I didn't have to worry about the usual noise of city life or traffic, but close enough that we could easily get to restaurants and shops if we needed to. The host, a middle-aged man named Craig, greeted us at the door with a big smile. He was a little too eager, but he seemed friendly enough. He showed us around the house, pointing out all the features, the antiques, and the little quirks of the place that gave it character. But when we got to the basement door, his enthusiasm grew a little more than I expected. "You'll love it," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "There's a great little secret down there, something that'll really make your stay memorable." His tone was odd, almost too excited, and his eyes sparkled like he was sharing some kind of joke. But when I looked at him, I couldn't quite figure out what he meant. I nodded politely, though. I didn't want to make it weird. "What's down there?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Oh, just a little surprise," Craig replied, still grinning. "Nothing to worry about. You'll find out soon enough." That was all he said about it before he gave us the rest of the tour. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was focused on getting settled in, figuring out where everyone was going to sleep, and making sure my kids weren't running off into the woods. It was a beautiful evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, the air cooling off as the night crept in. But the basement stayed on my mind. After we had dinner and got the kids to bed, I couldn't shake the curiosity. I decided I would check it out. Maybe there was something cool down there, old furniture, or maybe a wine cellar. I grabbed my phone just in case, knowing it could be a bit creepy being alone in a basement, especially one that was supposed to have some kind of secret. When I opened the door to the basement, the air felt musty, like it hadn't been opened in a while. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended, the dim light from the overhead bulb flickering just a little. The basement was unfinished, with exposed beams and concrete floors. It was exactly what you'd expect from an old house that hadn't been fully renovated. As I stepped further down, I noticed strange marks on the floor, dark stains like something had been dragged across the concrete. They were almost too neat, like they had been purposefully placed there, leading to the far wall. I frowned. It didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air, something that made the back of my neck tingle. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, the house was old, and old houses had their quirks. I took a few more steps, trying to get a closer look at the marks, but the flickering light overhead made it hard to see clearly. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, but they were mostly empty, save for a few boxes covered in dust. I walked toward the far corner, where the marks on the floor seemed to be more concentrated. I couldn't tell exactly what they were from, but I could feel my pulse quickening. There was something about it that just didn't sit right. It wasn't the mess. It was the way the place felt, like it was hiding something. I heard a noise behind me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, wood creaking, maybe, but then I heard it again, more distinct this time. Footsteps. Someone was walking downstairs. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was my brother. He had been pretty quiet earlier, and I assumed he'd just gotten up to grab something from the kitchen or go to the bathroom. I called out softly, "Hey, you down there?" No answer. I waited a moment, then called again, a little louder. Still nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I wasn't sure if I should go back upstairs or keep looking around. Part of me wanted to brush it off, tell myself it was nothing, but the other part of me, the part that didn't trust the house, was on edge. I turned to go back up the stairs, but before I could take a step, I froze. There, at the bottom of the stairs, standing perfectly still in the shadows, was a figure. Person. At first, I thought it was my brother, maybe playing a joke on me. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized this wasn't him. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The figure stood in place, not moving an inch, just staring at me. My heart began to race, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello!" No response. The figure just stood there, unmoving. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took a slow, careful step back toward the stairs, hoping to make a quick escape if I needed to. But before I could make it to the first step, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. No movement, no sound, like it had never been there at all. I bolted up the stairs, not looking back, my mind spinning. I reached the top of the stairs and locked the basement door behind me. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows in the house. I felt a chill running down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to wake anyone up. I didn't want to seem crazy. I didn't want to freak out my family over something that might have been nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. I kept replaying the moment in the basement over and over in my head. Was it a person? Was it a trick of the light? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, I told my brother about the footsteps and the figure in the basement. He laughed it off, saying I must have just imagined it or that it was probably just the house making weird noises. But when I mentioned the marks on the floor, his expression changed. He told me he'd noticed the same thing when he checked the basement the day before. He hadn't said anything, though, thinking it was just some old stains. We both agreed it was probably nothing, but there was a lingering sense of unease that neither of us could shake. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. We ate breakfast, packed up, and went about our day. But I couldn't stop thinking about that basement. Kept nagging at me, like an itch I couldn't reach. I decided I needed to leave early. Something about that house, about the way the host had acted, about the figure in the basement, made me feel like we weren't safe there anymore. I told my family I wanted to leave. We packed up quickly, not bothering to stick around for another night. I didn't want to risk it. We didn't say much to Craig when we checked out. He was polite enough, but there was an odd look in his eyes. Something like he knew exactly what had happened, but he wasn't saying anything. I left a message on the Airbnb app, telling them about the experience, but I never heard anything back. We drove away, the house shrinking behind us in the rearview mirror. The farther we got from that place, the more the tension in my chest started to ease. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, and maybe I never would. All I knew was that I wouldn't be going back there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden beneath that house, something that didn't want to be found. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week in a nice city, finally getting a break from work and life in general. I booked an Airbnb in a great location, near restaurants, shops, and all the places I wanted to see. The apartment looked charming in the photos, and the reviews were glowing. Most importantly, it was within my budget, and the host seemed really friendly. He messaged me before I even arrived, offering help with anything I might need. It felt welcoming, reassuring even, which was exactly what I needed after a stressful few months. When I got there, I was excited. The building itself was older, but the apartment had been recently renovated. The furniture was modern, the floors were shiny, and the windows let in plenty of sunlight. I had a great view of the street below and could hear the city humming in the background, the perfect combination of peace and energy. I spent the first few hours unpacking and getting settled. It felt good to finally be away, to have time for myself. That evening, after exploring the area a bit, I decided to cook dinner. The kitchen was well stocked with everything I needed. As I stirred a pot of pasta, I noticed something odd. The apartment was quiet, but I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Peered out, and there he was, the host. He was standing in front of the building, staring up at the window. I wasn't sure if he saw me, but it made me feel uneasy. He was just standing there, motionless. For a moment, I thought maybe he was checking on something related to the building or the neighborhood. Maybe he was waiting for a delivery or someone else. I wasn't sure. Either way, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I shrugged it off. Could have been nothing. But over the next few days, that feeling of unease didn't go away. I started noticing him more. Every time I looked out the window, he seemed to be standing in front of the building, either on his phone or just staring. At first, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe he lived nearby and was just going about his business. I didn't know what to make of it, but my gut told me something wasn't quite right. One evening, I was cooking again, just starting to chop vegetables when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I figured it was the host, maybe checking in to see how I was doing. I opened the door, and there he was, standing there with a smile, looking more like a friendly neighbor than a host. He didn't wait for me to say anything. He just stepped inside, as if he had every right to be there. "Hey, how are you doing? Are you comfortable?" he asked, his voice casual. I froze. I hadn't invited him in, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to react. I stepped back instinctively, just to make space. He didn't seem to notice or care. He just looked around the apartment like he was inspecting it. Yeah, I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm good, thanks." He nodded, still standing there, as though he wasn't ready to leave. I could feel my heart start to race a little. Something about the whole situation felt off. I didn't want to be rude, but at the same time, I didn't want him in my space. "I think I'm all set," I said, stepping toward the door. "I'll let you know if I need anything else." He hesitated for a moment, then gave me a tight smile and left without saying anything more. I shut the door and locked it immediately. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days were no better. I kept noticing him outside the building, always hanging around, sometimes looking up at my window. The strangest part was that he never seemed to acknowledge me directly. It was as though he was just hovering, waiting for something. Each time I saw him, I felt more and more uncomfortable, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to cause any trouble, especially since he was the one giving me a place to stay, but his behavior was starting to creep me out. Things escalated a few days later. I had just gotten out of the shower and was getting dressed when I heard something outside the door. I wasn't sure what it was at first, maybe a bump or a scrape, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. I froze, my stomach dropping to the floor. Someone was trying to open the door. I didn't move at first. I thought I might be imagining it, but the handle jiggled again, and then the sound of a faint knock. I walked quietly to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I peeked through the peephole and saw him, standing right outside, looking at his phone again, as if he hadn't just tried to open my door. I didn't know what to think. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Or was he purposely trying to get inside? I took a deep breath and waited until I was sure he was walking away before I unlocked the door. I needed some air, so I stepped outside into the hallway, hoping to see someone else, anyone, who could make me feel a little less alone. I didn't see anyone at first, but as I turned the corner, I saw him again. This time, standing in the hallway near the stairs, his back to me, still on his phone. He didn't seem to notice me, but when he finally turned around, our eyes met. He gave a brief nod and then just stood there, waiting for me to say something. I didn't know what to say. I just kept walking past him, my breath quickening as I felt him watching me. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't make sense of what was happening. Why was he always around? Why did he keep trying to interact with me in such a strange way? And most importantly, why was he trying to get into my apartment? That night, after trying to calm myself down, I got into bed and locked the door. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were secure, though I knew it probably wouldn't make much difference if he really wanted to get in. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence. I kept hearing little noises, creaks in the walls, the hum of the building. But what I was really listening for was any sound that would tell me he was near, any sign that I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little noise set me on edge, my body tense, my mind racing. I finally fell asleep in fits and starts, only to wake up feeling even more unsettled. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up my things, trying to stay calm, but every time I heard a noise in the hallway, I felt my heart jump. By the time I was ready to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still around. I grabbed my keys and suitcase, but when I stepped into the hallway to leave, I saw him again. This time, standing near the elevator, staring at me. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, just stood there. I swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze, and quickly made my way to the stairs, not looking back. When I got outside, I didn't feel safe until I was on the street, away from the building. The sun was just starting to set, and everything felt different, as if the city itself had changed in the time I'd been there. I was shaken, exhausted, and glad to be gone. I never reported him. I didn't know what I would say. How could I explain what happened? I was afraid I'd sound paranoid or overreacting, even though every instinct I had told me something was wrong. I didn't want to confront him. I didn't want to risk making things worse, so I left quietly, relieved to be out of that place. But I won't forget how it felt, the way I was made to feel so uncomfortable in a place that was supposed to be safe. The whole experience left me feeling vulnerable and unsure of where to turn next. I still don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was just a weird, overly attentive host. Maybe he was trying to be friendly in his own strange way. But whatever the reason, the constant hovering, the attempted entry, the strange encounters, they made me feel like I wasn't safe, not even in my own space. And I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. I rented a small apartment in a busy city for a week. I had been planning this trip for months, and when I found the listing on Airbnb, it seemed perfect. The apartment was advertised as modern, clean, and safe, located in a well-known neighborhood full of cafes, restaurants, and shopping. The photos looked pristine, with sleek furniture and minimalist decor. The reviews were mostly positive, and the host seemed friendly and accommodating. It seemed like everything was going to be fine, and I was excited about having a little retreat in the middle of a busy city. The apartment was small but cozy, just the way I like it. A single bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a small kitchen area with a dining table. It had everything I needed: clean towels, a stocked fridge, and a comfortable bed. I spent the first couple of days exploring the city, enjoying the sights, and relaxing in the apartment in the evenings. It was exactly what I had been looking for, and I felt safe in my little haven away from home. But things started to feel off by the second night. It was subtle at first, little things that didn't quite sit right. When I arrived, I noticed that the deadbolt on the front door didn't seem to lock properly. It wasn't that it didn't lock at all. It just didn't feel secure. When I turned the key, the bolt would slide, but not as smoothly as I expected. It felt like there was something wrong with it, like the mechanism wasn't aligned right. I tried not to think too much about it, figuring I was just being overly cautious. I mean, the door looked sturdy enough, and the lock seemed functional, but something about it bothered me. I also started hearing noises in the hallway outside the apartment. At first, I assumed it was just the usual sounds of a busy building: footsteps, voices, the clinking of keys. But after a while, it became more consistent. Every night, around midnight or so, I would hear a soft knock on my door, followed by silence. At first, I thought it was just other guests coming and going, but then I realized something didn't add up. The knock wasn't the kind of knock you'd hear from someone who was just coming home late. It was soft, almost hesitant, and after the knock, there was always complete silence. No one walking away, no sounds of keys or people talking in the hall. Just silence. I began checking the peephole obsessively, hoping to see someone walking by, but there was never anyone there. Sometimes I would wait for what felt like an eternity, staring through the tiny lens in the door, hoping for a glimpse of movement. But every time, there was nothing. It felt like the knock was happening in the middle of the night, as if someone were standing on the other side of my door, waiting for me to answer. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably nothing. But deep down, something told me that there was more to it. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong anymore. I woke up suddenly, disoriented, in the middle of the night. My first thought was that I'd heard something that made me jump awake from a deep sleep. My heart was racing, and the room was pitch black. It took me a moment to realize what had happened. The deadbolt on the front door had slid open. I could hear it, the unmistakable sound of metal sliding over metal in the dead of night. I bolted upright in bed, panic rising in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The door, the deadbolt, it was open. Someone had opened it. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I rushed to the door, every instinct telling me to check the hallway, to see if someone was there. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. I held my breath, terrified of what I might find on the other side. I slowly opened the door and peeked out into the dark hallway. Nothing. The hallway was silent. No one was there. I stepped out a little further, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to peer around the corner. But it was empty. The hallway was just as I had left it before I went to bed. I quickly shut the door, locking it again with trembling hands. The deadbolt slid into place with a soft click, but it didn't feel secure. Still felt wrong. I checked the peephole again, just in case, but there was nothing to see. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was I dreaming? I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain: I was terrified. Someone had tried to open my door while I was sleeping. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. I kept thinking about the knock that had come every night, about the sound of the deadbolt sliding open. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to get inside. The next morning, I tried to push the fear to the back of my mind. Maybe I had just been hearing things, I thought. Maybe the lock was just faulty. But when I went to check out the door in the daylight, I noticed something else that made my stomach turn. The door frame was scratched, like someone had been trying to force the door open. The marks were faint, but they were there. It wasn't enough to make me feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. I reported everything to Airbnb as soon as I could, explaining what had happened. The knocking, the sound of the deadbolt opening, the strange scratches on the door. The response I got from the host was dismissive, to say the least. They told me that they had never had any issues with the door before, and that the lock was perfectly fine. They seemed annoyed that I had even brought it up, which only added to my sense of unease. I didn't feel safe anymore. It wasn't just the door or the knocks. It was the way everything felt wrong, like someone was trying to get in and was getting closer with each passing day. The anxiety was eating at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen if I stayed. I didn't sleep well for the next 2 nights, and by the morning of the 6th day, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to stay another night. Couldn't. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into my suitcase in a panic. I double-checked the locks on the door one last time, but it didn't make me feel any better. I didn't trust the door anymore. I left the apartment and checked out early, but the unease lingered. As I walked away from the building, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, someone who had been watching me all along. But when I turned around, there was nothing. No one was there. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but as I left the city, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks, the door, the strange feeling that something was off. I had been staying in a place I thought was safe, and yet something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I don't know what was going on with that apartment, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stay in an Airbnb like that again. I learned the hard way that not everything that looks perfect on the outside is safe. And sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't just in your head. I'd been to a few spooky places in my life, but nothing compared to the old Victorian house I rented for a weekend. It looked like the kind of place that was full of history, the kind of history that wasn't exactly comforting. I came across it on Airbnb, listed as charming and filled with history. The photos online made it look quaint, with its weathered, faded charm and old-world elegance. I was looking for a peaceful retreat, a break from the hectic pace of everyday life. Little did I know, I was walking straight into something I couldn't explain. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The house sat on a quiet street, tucked away from the rest of the world, surrounded by tall, overgrown trees. It was one of those houses you could picture in a movie, tall with a steep roof and intricate woodwork. The front door was made of heavy wood, with a tarnished brass knocker that seemed to have seen better days. When I pushed the door open, it creaked as if the house itself was groaning, tired from age. Inside, the air was cooler than I expected. I stepped in and immediately felt an eerie chill. It wasn't freezing, but the air had a heaviness to it, as if the house itself was exhaling a long-held breath. The walls were covered in dark wallpaper, peeling in places, with faded portraits hanging crookedly, staring down at me from every corner. The furniture was old dark wood, carved with intricate patterns. The kind of stuff you would see in a museum, not a living room. Everything had a musty smell like old books and dust, but there was something else there, too. Something off. I took a deep breath and shook it off. I was here for a peaceful weekend away from everything, and I wasn't about to let a few old portraits freak me out. I made my way through the house, lugging my suitcase behind me, trying to figure out where everything was. The place was massive, far bigger than I'd expected. The rooms seemed to stretch on forever, each one more grand and empty than the last. The kitchen was old, with rusted metal appliances and a wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The living room had a fireplace, the kind with a heavy stone mantel, but it had clearly been unused for a long time. I dropped my bags in one of the upstairs bedrooms, a room with a large, creaky bed covered in a faded floral comforter. The room had an antique vanity with a mirror that seemed to catch the dim light in a way that made it look like the reflections were slightly out of sync with the room itself. It was unnerving, but I didn't let it bother me. I opened the window to let some fresh air in, but the breeze felt colder than I expected, as though the house was exhaling something colder than the outside air. As evening settled in, I decided to make the most of the place. I made myself a simple dinner, though the kitchen didn't exactly inspire confidence. The light flickered overhead as I sat down to eat, casting strange shadows across the walls. I wasn't sure if it was the age of the house or if something else was causing it. The flickering was brief, but it left me with a strange sense of unease. I shrugged it off and focused on my meal, but the whispers started not long after. At first, I thought I was hearing things. The house was old, and the wind outside was picking up. It wasn't unusual for old homes to make creaking noises. But then the whispers got louder, a soft murmur that seemed to come from just behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing. The room was empty. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. It was just the house settling. I'd heard about houses like this before. Old, full of character, and a little bit unsettling. Nothing to worry about. The evening dragged on, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house grew darker. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, and I couldn't help but feel that I was being watched. I decided to go to bed early, hoping the sleep would clear my mind. That night, I woke up to the sound of creaking floors. At first, I thought it was just the house, but the sounds grew louder, as though someone, or something, was walking around in the hallway outside my door. I lay perfectly still, listening, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy, like the steps of someone who didn't care if they were heard. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and crept over to the door. I opened it a crack and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. It was empty. The house was still, too still. I breathed a sigh of relief, closing the door quietly behind me and trying to go back to sleep. But I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was too strong now. The whispers were back, but they weren't just behind me anymore. They were all around me, swirling in the air like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. I finally drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I dreamt of walking through the house, though I couldn't see anyone. The rooms were all dark, and the air was thick with dust. The whispers in the dream were louder, and I could almost understand them, almost. But every time I got close, the words slipped away from me. When I woke up the next morning, I felt off. My head was heavy, my body sore as though I hadn't slept at all. I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face and caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. My back was itching, and when I reached to scratch it, I felt something odd. I looked at my hand and realized there was something on my back. When I turned to look at the mirror again, I saw deep scratches running across my skin. 3 long, jagged lines, like something had clawed me in my sleep. I froze. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't remember anything scratching me, didn't remember any pain. It didn't make sense. I had been alone the entire night. I ran my fingers over the scratches, and they felt real, deep, raw, and angry. Without thinking, I started packing my things. I had to get out of there. Something wasn't right about this place. I couldn't explain it, but the sense of dread had built up so much that I felt like I was suffocating. I threw my things into my bag in a hurry, not even bothering to organize anything, just desperate to leave. As I headed down the stairs, I felt a presence behind me. The air seemed to thicken, and the house felt like it was pressing in on me. I could hear the whispering again, only this time it was louder. It sounded like words I couldn't understand, as though the house itself was speaking, or maybe something in it was. I wasn't sure anymore. I reached the front door, and just as I was about to open it, I saw it. A shadow moved across the hallway. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood. It was darker than the rest of the room, darker than the shadows around it. It moved in a way that made no sense, as if it were fluid, undulating, shifting in and out of the darkness. I froze. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and I realized that it wasn't just an odd light or a trick of the eye. It was something in the house, something alive. I didn't wait to see if it would come closer. I opened the door and ran out into the cold, unfeeling night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, driving away from that place as fast as I could. The whole time, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the house in the distance, watching me. But when I looked back, it was just the road stretching ahead of me. I don't know what happened in that house. Maybe it was just the age of the place, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure: I will never go back there. That house has something in it, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. I don't know what it is, but I'm glad I left before I found out. I had been looking forward to my weekend getaway for weeks. I'd been craving a break from the chaos of city life, some quiet time in the woods to recharge. After scouring Airbnb for hours, I finally found the perfect place. A cozy cabin nestled deep in the forest. It was secluded, tucked away on a private road, far from the nearest neighbor, far from the noise of traffic and honking horns. Just what I needed. The cabin in the pictures looked absolutely beautiful. The wood was weathered, but in a charming, rustic way. There was a stone fireplace that looked perfect for chilly nights, and the windows, though a little fogged, offered stunning views of the surrounding trees. It seemed like the perfect escape, a little slice of paradise, and I was ready to leave everything behind for the weekend. I arrived on Friday evening, just as the sun was starting to set. The cabin was even more picturesque in person. The trees surrounding it were thick and wild, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. I parked my car and grabbed my bags, eager to get inside and unwind. But something was off from the very start. The first thing I noticed was the door. It didn't close properly, not in the way you'd expect from an old cabin, but in a way that made me feel uneasy. It didn't latch shut when I pushed it. I had to pull it harder than usual to get it to close completely. And even then, there was a little gap at the top of the door. I shrugged it off. It was an old cabin, after all. I wasn't expecting perfect. Inside, the place was just as charming as I'd imagined. There were 2 small bedrooms, a little kitchen with antique-looking appliances, and a living room with that stone fireplace I'd been eyeing in the pictures. I tossed my bags on the couch and sat down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was slowly creeping up on me. The first thing I did was unpack a little, organizing my things and putting away some snacks. The cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke, the air thick with the scent of the forest outside. It wasn't unpleasant, but it added to the isolation. It was so quiet. I could hear nothing but the soft creaking of the wood, the occasional gust of wind, and the rustling of leaves outside. I thought it would be a good idea to light the fireplace and get comfortable, so I started gathering firewood. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching noise. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel, something scurrying around on the roof or the trees. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on starting the fire. But the scratching persisted, a rhythmic sound, almost like something was tapping at the wood. It wasn't a one-off noise. It came in regular intervals, each scrape followed by a brief silence, then another scrape. It was too steady to be random, too deliberate. I froze, holding a log in my hand, listening. The sound came from above. I told myself it was nothing. Squirrels, raccoons, maybe even a branch scraping against the roof in the wind. I didn't want to let my imagination get the best of me, so I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. I lit the fire and sat down to enjoy the warmth. But even though the fire crackled and the flames danced, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time it got dark, I had managed to settle in a bit more. The house was warm, and I was cozy in my blanket, watching a movie on my laptop. I heard the scratching again, this time a little louder. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard something else. Footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps from above, right above my bedroom. The ceiling creaked with each step, the floorboards groaning as if someone was walking around in the attic. My heart raced. I jumped up, grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and went upstairs to check the entire cabin. The attic door was locked. The upstairs rooms were empty. There was nothing out of place. I went into the attic anyway, shining my flashlight around the dusty, cobwebbed corners. Empty. The floorboards in the attic creaked, but it was just the house settling. There was no one there. I felt foolish. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was all in my head. I made my way back downstairs, locked the door behind me, and crawled into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind outside, every crack in the walls. I was too on edge to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something moving in the house. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, my head throbbing from lack of sleep. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a fog. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the window at the trees. The sun was bright, the birds were singing, and it seemed like a perfect day to hike. I tried to push the weird noises and my restless night to the back of my mind. I didn't want to let my paranoia ruin the trip, but the peace didn't last long. When I was sitting on the couch later that morning, I absent-mindedly reached under the cushions to adjust my pillows. That's when I felt something hard, a small, cold object wedged under the fabric. I pulled it out and my stomach dropped. It was a tiny black camera, the kind you'd find in a hidden spy kit. The lens was small, barely visible. My hands trembled as I held it. It looked brand new, too clean for something that had been left here by mistake. I stared at the camera for a long time, my mind racing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The cabin was supposed to be a private getaway. The host had promised that it was all mine, that no one would bother me. But there, tucked away in the couch, was evidence that someone had been watching me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. All those strange noises, the footsteps, the way the door didn't close properly. It was all starting to make sense. Someone had been watching me the whole time. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I didn't know who to trust. The host hadn't been responsive to my messages or calls. The place had been advertised as a secluded cabin, but now it felt more like a trap. I didn't know who had placed the camera, but I knew I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I grabbed my things, packed as quickly as I could, and went straight for the car. I didn't care about my weekend getaway anymore. I just wanted to get as far away from that cabin as possible. I sent one last message to the host, demanding an explanation. They never replied. As I drove away, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me, watching me from the woods. The further I got, the more my heart started to settle, but the unease lingered. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the hidden camera to the authorities, but they never found anyone. The host's profile was taken down soon after, and I never received a refund. I don't know what happened to the camera or who had been behind it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped a very dangerous situation. I learned something that weekend. Sometimes the quiet, secluded places are more dangerous than the noise of the city. And no matter how charming a place looks, it's always wise to trust your instincts. I had rented the apartment for a week. It was a small place, located in a vibrant downtown area, right in the middle of everything. Restaurants, shops, bars, and even a few museums within walking distance. I had come into the city for a work trip and decided to go the Airbnb route to avoid the high prices of hotels. The listing looked great. The photos on the app showed a clean, modern space with large windows that let in plenty of light. The neighborhood seemed lively, with people walking down the street, laughing, and living their lives. It seemed like the perfect spot for a short stay. The host had been friendly and communicative. They'd sent me a message when I checked in, offering recommendations for places to eat nearby. The apartment itself was on the third floor of an older building, but everything inside was updated. The living room was cozy, with a couch that faced a flat-screen TV. There was a little kitchenette off to the side, and a small dining table near the windows, where I could sit and look out over the busy street below. It had a certain charm about it, an ideal little space for one person. First, everything went smoothly. I spent the first couple of days working during the day and exploring the city at night. The weather was perfect, and I enjoyed the energy of the downtown area, watching the lights twinkle in the evening and feeling the buzz of the city around me. The apartment felt like a haven when I returned from the busy streets. A quiet, safe place to relax after a long day. But things started to feel a little off after a few days. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a sense of unease that began to grow. The first thing that set me on edge was the sound. I was sitting at the table in the living room, working on my laptop, when I heard something from the hallway outside the apartment. It was faint, just a thud, like a door closing or someone brushing against the wall. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had actually heard anything, or if it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. I didn't think much of it at the time. The next day, I came back from dinner around 9:30 p.m. The streetlights outside were flickering, and I had to fumble with my keys for a moment before I could unlock the front door to the building. When I stepped inside the lobby, I felt that familiar chill of the air as the door clicked shut behind me. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, reached for my keys, and opened the door to the apartment. That's when I noticed it. The door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, but just enough to make my stomach drop. I stood there for a second, staring at it. I hadn't left it open. In fact, I had made sure to lock it when I left earlier. My mind raced as I quickly ran through every possibility. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly? Maybe I had just forgotten? But no, when I left the apartment, I was sure the door had been locked. I stepped forward cautiously, pushing the door open with a little more force than necessary. My eyes scanned the interior, looking for anything out of place. The apartment was dimly lit by the soft glow of a table lamp in the living room. Everything looked as I had left it. The couch, the kitchen counter, the little knickknacks on the shelf, all exactly where I had left them. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no open drawers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked around, double-checking the windows, the bathroom, and even under the bed. Nothing seemed disturbed, but still, that feeling lingered, like something wasn't quite right. I locked the door behind me, making sure the bolt slid into place. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lock, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and the sudden noise startled me. I glanced at the screen, nothing urgent, just a work-related email. But it didn't matter. The unease wouldn't leave. I tried to shake it off and decided to go to bed. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the busy streets had left me on edge. I turned out the lights, crawled under the covers, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come. My mind kept racing, replaying the moment I'd found the door ajar. What if someone had been inside? What if I hadn't noticed something? I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it was just a mistake, just a misstep in my mind. Then it happened. I heard footsteps outside the door. I wasn't sure at first if I was imagining it, but the sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps, moving from one end of the hallway to the other. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart began to pound. It sounded like someone was walking back and forth, just outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen, trying to determine if it was just the building settling. But no, there it was again, clear as day. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The footsteps weren't fast or hurried. They were slow, almost as if the person knew I was inside. I didn't know what to do. I felt exposed, vulnerable. My first instinct was to get out of bed and confront whoever was out there. But the thought of opening the door made my stomach turn. I felt trapped. I grabbed my phone and texted Airbnb, hoping someone would respond. I wasn't sure what to say. "I hear footsteps outside my door" sounded ridiculous, even to me, but I sent it anyway. The seconds felt like hours. The footsteps kept pacing back and forth outside, and I could hear the creak of floorboards as they moved. My mind raced. Should I call the police? Should I try to escape out the window? I didn't want to make any noise, but the fear was consuming me. What if the person knew I was there? What if they were waiting for me to come out? I slid off the bed quietly and crouched by the closet. I had to hide. There was no other choice. I grabbed a sweatshirt off the shelf and wrapped it around myself, trying to make as little noise as possible. I crept to the closet and opened the door, slipping inside, my breath shallow and rapid. I pressed myself against the back wall, hoping that whoever was outside wouldn't think to check. The footsteps continued, growing more erratic now, like whoever was out there was pacing in agitation. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked at my phone again. No response from Airbnb. I texted them again, more urgently this time, explaining that I thought someone was outside my door and that I was hiding in the closet. Still, no response. Minutes stretched on forever. My mind was racing, imagining every worst-case scenario. What if it wasn't just one person? What if there was a group? What if they knew I was hiding? What if they were just waiting for me to make a move? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief flooded over me, but I couldn't move. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, praying that the police would get here in time. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Complete, unsettling silence. I stayed in the closet, heart hammering in my chest, until I heard the faintest knock at the door. Then the sound of voices, deep, muffled, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. The police had arrived. I heard them talking outside the door, asking if anyone was inside, checking for signs of an intruder. After what felt like forever, one of them knocked gently on the door and called out, asking if it was safe to enter. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to be sure. They were right outside, just on the other side of the door, so close yet so far. I could hear them moving, their boots on the old floor, and the sound of their radios crackling. "Are you in there?" one of the officers called, his voice muffled but clear. "Yes," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. "I'm in here." They told me to stay put while they checked the rest of the apartment. A few minutes later, they came in. I stepped out of the closet, feeling like I was finally safe, but still shaken to my core. They did a thorough search of the place, checking every corner, every room. They confirmed there was no one else in the apartment. No signs of forced entry, no intruder, just a locked door and a strange set of circumstances. The officer who spoke to me explained that they'd had some calls about unusual activity in the building recently, but there was nothing concrete. I didn't feel any better, but I didn't argue. I was too scared to stay another night in that apartment. The next morning, I packed up my things and checked out. I didn't bother waiting for a response from Airbnb. I was done. The thought of staying in that apartment any longer, even with the police confirming everything was fine, was too much for me. I left the key in the lockbox and got out as quickly as I could. As I walked down the street, the sun rising over the city, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering fear. The city was just as busy as before. People walking past me, laughing, chatting, unaware of the fear that had taken over my life for the past 12 hours. I never went back to that building. I canceled the rest of my stay with Airbnb and booked a new place in a different part of the city. I never told anyone the full story. I never wanted to think about it again. All I knew was that the next time I booked an Airbnb, I would make sure to read the reviews a hell of a lot more carefully.